morning. So while I do the thing where I hope my laptop seamlessly transitions and you secretly hope something embarrassing happens, quick survey. How many of you have been doing this open source thing for more than 20 years? Less than 15. Less than 10. Less than 5. Oh, we're gonna have fun. Great. Oh, something slightly embarrassing happened. There's no video on that screen. That's exciting. There we go. Yay. So I have decades of photos of open source things, conferences, events, workplaces. So I literally searched my Google Photos for open source and came up with this set here. What I want to talk about is open source has been wildly successful. However, its future from this point forward is not guaranteed. And so I want to talk about that and how the key, spoilers, the key to making sure that we do continue to exist is community, which was a great intro from Paul with all he said about community. So I hate talks where somebody spends forever introducing themselves. So just as a quick way of introduction, why does Ruth have anything to say about any of this? I wear a lot of hats. I've also been a part of many other parts of the ecosystem over the years and will tell you things through those lenses. I'm not here to talk about products or sway you to Apache projects, although I love how many Apache contributors are here. I just want to talk about this inflection point that we're at in software development, in open source, across the entire industry, the whole open source ecosystem. So to get to the next decade of open source, it's important that we understand the first decades of it. And so I love how many of you are kind of new to this. This is going to be a little bit, for those who raise their hands, they've been doing this longer than 20 years, I'm going to be telling them their own history. The rest of you are going to go to history class with me. I promise it'll be more fun than whenever you experienced a history class in school. So there are a few dividing lines in open source in general software history. And so I draw these three chunks into history, with one line at 1998, which is when the term open source was coined, and then another around 2022. And we're going to look at it in those three chunks. So my fellow olds are going to stumble down nostalgia alley with me. Disclaimer, it's very hard to condense history because there's so much that we can say in only so much time. And everybody has their own memory of what was actually very, very important. And they're going to say, but you forgot X. And I feel you. I feel you very deeply. And we can talk about it over coffee. And I also will say, OMG, I remember that too. Disclaimer two for everyone, in the interest of time, I'm going to put some not entirely the same things in a blender. Home computing, business computing, the history of the internet into a big blender. But come along with me here because it's all intertwined and important to why open source was able to become the success that it is. So some of you will remember all of this. Some of you were not yet born. The first chunk of that timeline, before I was born as well, going back to pre-1969. Hardware was only made by a handful of companies, and software was not sold. It was something that just came along with the hardware. This particular group was known as IBM and the Seven Dwarfs. These are the ones that were making hardware. Then in 1969, IBM unbundled the hardware and software, probably for legal reasons, which is to say they started selling software separately, which means that now there's also a market for companies to sell only software. And so then by January of 1973, there's this article in the New York Times that says, Snow White, IBM, has had her morals questioned. 2 of the 7 dwarves are dead and business is better than ever. And a lot of that article is about how complicated the software industry has already gotten after just existing for 4 years. So software as profitable proprietary product has begun. And as I'm sure you know, history repeats itself. This is hardly the first time that people have gotten protective over something they made. And so this is my way back history lesson. This is your fun fact. You are going to be A+ in pub trivia when you leave any talk of mine. So as best we can tell, the first formal trademark legislation in the world was passed in England under King Henry III in 1266. What does that have to do with anything? It was not all that dissimilar to where we are now in software, because that was regulation to make sure that you knew where your bread came from and that it was safe. Does this sound familiar? So now, understanding the problem of bread fraud, why that was even a thing in 1266, requires an understanding of bread and the history around it and where the grain was coming from, all of that, which is a great story. But what's important is that it's super analogous to where we are in software history. I promise I won't talk about bread for another 30 minutes, even though I would love to. Instead, I'm going to glaze over a whole lot of the 70s and 80s in software, but there was public domain software, there was freeware, and there was shareware. There was a lot of shareware. And it would have a screen that looked like this. Does anybody, my fellow olds, does anybody know what this is? What is it? Just yell it at me. It is a game. It is not Doom. Everybody always says Doom. This is Commander Keen. Yeah, one of my faves as a kid. So, if you had a computer, which was a big if, you'd get floppies in the mail or in a magazine or from a friend, or if you had to, in a weird $5 bin in the back of some store somewhere. And by the way, there's a whole internet following of these if you need to go play Commander Keen when we're done, where you get your ROMs is on you. But importantly, shareware is not open source software. However, this was the context that people understood free software in when all of this started to happen. So I drew that dividing line at 1998 because that's when the term open source was coined. But getting to that point was this increasingly frenetic pace of really important moments. So going through that time period, ARPANET had been setting up these public RFCs to produce the fledgling internet protocols. In 1983, Stallman announced the GNU project. In 85, founded the FSF. By 1985, 15% of homes in the US have computers, only 15%. That year, hardware and software sales grew by 10%, which was triple the rate of the overall economy. It was 13% globally. Fortune magazine called it the fastest growing commercial endeavor ever by far. This is the headline of the story I'm citing there. It says, look whose earnings are down, IBM, Apple, Digital, and more. Not all big companies will survive the rough 90s, but the smart and the tough will stand to prosper. By 99, that 15% had become 51%. In 1999, Tim Berners-Lee, sorry, not 99, in 1990, Tim Berners-Lee created CERN HDBD, the first web server. My favorite part of this, you can go to Geneva and take a picture of this paper yourself. The handwriting at the very top, vague but exciting, indeed. 1991, the famous Linux email that starts all of that. 1993, NCSA Mosaic was released. It was proprietary software, but non-commercial use was free, which has some echoes of Creative Commons here in the future. In 1993, CERN put all of the materials of their little World Wide Web project in the public domain and started planning an event for the next year. And in 1994, they had that first international World Wide Web conference at CERN. By that point, there were 10,000 servers, 10,000 servers. 2,000 of them were commercial, and they had 10 million users. Later that year, Netscape Navigator was released, not open source yet. But in 1994, there was also this thing on C-SPAN network in the US called the Superhighway Summit. This is the weirdest event that has ever happened in technology history. It was the Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, along with the CEOs of like Disney and QVC, and the FCC chairman, Rupert Murdoch, was there. A character from Laugh-In, which was this variety TV show from the 60s, it was the strangest event. But what it is probably most remembered for was Al Gore saying, during my service in the United States Congress, I took the initiative in creating the internet. And it was this piece of this bigger context that is all he was remembered for. So then 1998 is such a wild year, and really just a wild first quarter. It would not even begin to fit on that slide. So The Cathedral and the Bazaar, if you're familiar with that book, it was originally published in 97, but then put out in book form in 99, so 98 is kind of when it's getting around. On January 23rd, 1998, Netscape announced that the browser and its source code would be free. Then on February 3rd, there was a strategy meeting in Palo Alto where the term open source was coined as a direct result of the things that led to this. And the OSI was born about 2 weeks later. So does anybody have a guess what website this is in 1998? This is opensource.org. This is the OSI's website. This is the first version of it in 1998. And it already says for 20 years we've been building momentum as soon as it launched. On March 31st, the Mozilla project was officially founded out of Netscape. It was originally called Phoenix because it was rising from the ashes of Netscape. And so this is it. We're off to the races. Open source software has officially begun under that name, but built on the shoulders of all of those decades of software that had come before it. 1998, for those of you who were not living through that, was a wildly different time technologically. We had very slow dial-up connections. We called the tiny fledgling internet the information superhighway. Love it, bringing it back. That term starts getting replaced by e-commerce around 98. It's really interesting to see that graph of language flip. Honestly, half of the web in 1998 is under construction GIFs, and if you think that's a joke, just turn to an old person next to you and they will confirm that this is accuracy. Google is this fresh little startup. Amazon exists if you can convince your mom to let you put the credit card number into the computer, which she is definitely not going to let you do, but it's a great place to buy your textbooks if you happen to be a student at the time. Flash animations are still years away. YouTube, way further than that. Mark Zuckerberg is in 10th grade. That's where we are in 1998. Actually, the most popular site was Yahoo, which was it was not a search engine, it was a directory like a telephone book. You click through the categories of things that you want. Its print magazine, called Yahoo Internet Life, promised somewhere in between there that one day you would check your email from anywhere. And software security threats are very different. Time and pretty much everybody else is threatening the end of everything over all of this. It's doom. So my point here is that imagining how critical the web is to everyday life here in 2026, much less imagining a refrigerator that would keep track of what's in it and remind you with a text that you need to buy milk, that sounded bananas. It was pretty much like a extremely optimistic update to Disney's Carousel of Progress, if you've ever been through this thing at Disney World that takes you through the history of technology. But little by little, that's what we did. And open source development was this quiet little current running under all of it. So I think we frequently see this part of a comment that Bill Gates made around this time about Linux. It's never going to be a commercial competitor, no big deal. But in the context of the rest of the quote, it is even more amazing. He says what will hold open source back, it'll never work out, because there's no central point of control. Anybody can go into the code, and they do. Yes, in fact, that is exactly what made us succeed, what he said would make us fail. So for about the next 2 years, there's this spate of conversation and news articles and magazine spreads about open source. This is the New York Times, January 4th, 1999. I love this headline, free access to a software code. I would like one software code, please. In here, it also makes the note that Linux rhymes with cynics. Hilarious. About halfway down, Bob Young from Red Hat says, the answer to whether open source can be a successful business model has already been answered. 8 months after this was when they IPO'd. Seems to have worked out. It also says that unforeseen was one of the year's most striking developments, the surging popularity of what has been called open source software, probably because it had been long regarded by the industry's most powerful players as more of a political ideology than a way to make money. Long regarded, so they're recognizing that long tail of history that got us there, but also that what we had was a technology change that many of its supporters thought of and still do, not just as a massive shift in the way that computers affected our lives, but as a philosophy, as a moral issue, really. And we underlined that for a lot of years with job titles like open source evangelist. But importantly to our timeline, here, now, around the turn of the century, is when the article stopped. Pretty much dead. Open source stops being in headlines for a very long time. There's, the Red Hat IPO, tech news, that sort of thing, but other than that, that's it. So the entire middle chunk of our timeline is just that. It's quiet. We made a big, loud entrance. And then we made the software that the entire world depends on for absolutely everything, while nobody noticed. In fact, a few were pretty actively opposed, but they slowly, quietly started changing their minds. I don't mean to crap on Microsoft here. It's just very easy to find these quotes. In fact, I have to make a little side note. Back in my title slide, there was this little image. I have told the story of this a million times, but I didn't realize I still had the picture. What that is the Microsoft booth at LinuxCon in 2015 announcing their first open source program, When Pigs Fly, and other things you never thought you'd see. After all of that. So that's where we were. And so here we are on the other side of silently winning. A lot happened in that 25 years. For example, in the early days of the ASF, the purpose of the foundation was really about just making it easier to build a project, very different from where we are here in the future with hundreds of projects and thousands of contributors. And then the license comes along, all of that. So we've been really good as an ecosystem at adapting to change over the years, but now we're facing a challenge that I think it feels like a sneak attack, but in a lot of ways was a long time coming, and we had it growing all along. So in 1999, the beginning of that middle chunk of the timeline, the quiet timeline, such a tiny speck in the history of technology, the biggest tech news of the spring, not even just tech news, everywhere, was the Melissa virus, which affected a whole 1 million email accounts. I'm pretty sure I have 1 million email accounts myself at this point. Slowed some stuff down for a few days. But if this were a novel, we would call that foreshadowing, and in fact, the FBI page that's still live about it does call it foreshadowing. Here's my XKCD tax, because I know you're not allowed to have a talk with that one. So years go by, there's name your favorite security problem, Eternal Blue, SQL injections, Heartbleed, SolarWinds, whatever. Those were all when you're lying in bed and the alarm clock goes off and you know you have to get up, but you smash the snooze button and your partner on the other side of the bed didn't even hear it go off at all. That's kind of what was going on here. We're still at the very front edge of that last bit of our timeline now, but the reason I draw that divider at 2022 is because that's when what will always feel like the tipping point to me and a lot of other folks happened, because the Log4Shell vulnerability happened over Thanksgiving weekend in 2021. And that's when it felt like the whole world woke up one morning and realized that, everything runs on open source, and they didn't really know what that meant and were very uncomfortable with it. So for those who hadn't been doing this, who hadn't spent those years and years convincing people that open source wasn't just some hobby thing and that you could run a successful business on it and run the whole world on it, it's a bit of a surprise. And so the US Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs held a hearing on this. Lots of other folks got involved. And they weren't the only ones who started asking questions about things that probably have obvious answers to the most of the people in this room. But if you were coming at this from zero, I kind of understand what the thought process was. Because if all you know about software is, okay, it's pretty much a product, and you think about what happens with other products that you know when there's a problem, you ask, okay, who made it and who uses it? They were very uncomfortable with the answers to those questions. Log4j is an Apache project, of course, and so we in the Senate, that sentence is the ASF, tell them all of our work is done by volunteers. It's all volunteers. And they say, okay, I don't quite understand. How can it be that all of this very important stuff that the world depends on is made by volunteers? Are they just not good enough to get paid? Are they just very bored? What exactly is happening here? I can understand why it might be startling to realize that the stuff that's on satellites and in your car and running the stock market and your phone and everything you do all day comes from a place that I can't name. And then they ask, who uses it? And the answer, everybody, did not help. So over the next 2 years, absolutely everyone noticed. And if you go searching the news archives again, open source reappears in the headlines again after that 25 years of silence. And then the proposed regulations start pouring in. Actually, this one's been revoked. This one never even passed. This is merely a sample. The list grows every day. If we throw AI into the list, we have a researcher at Duke University who told me recently that he is tracking 5,000 pieces of legislation around the globe that mention AI. So we are at an inflection point in software history now. How we are allowed and required to build software and ship software is going to change dramatically in the next few years, and open source is the center of everything. And everybody in writing these regulations cares most about one thing, and it's security. So if we go back to our timeline, we can superimpose an evolution from physical access attacks, punch card attacks were a thing, direct attacks, worms, viruses, Melissa, Morris, all of that. Early 2000s was perimeter cybercrime, going after an individual business. And then we get to this future where it's about dependencies, going after these complex, interconnected systems for wider impact. That's where we are now. And there will always be a log4j. There will always be something that wasn't a malicious attack, but simply code isn't perfect. That will always happen. But what's important is that when the code, as we all know in this room, is visible to everyone, we have a better opportunity to address it. And of course, now we have the boss level in this game of AI security challenges. I know there are some talks about that today, and so I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, if for no other reason, because whatever I say will be out of date by the time I finish the sentence. So what I do want to say is that dealing with that influx of AI-related security challenges is going to be expensive, and we already kind of had a money problem in open source. We have seen the economic studies of what open source means financially. So a few years ago, the EU estimated that the economic impact of open source in Europe was in the neighborhood of 65 to 95 billion euros. Then in 2024, there was this Harvard Business School study that said that the supply side value of open source is around 4.15 billion. The demand side was closer to 8 or 9 trillion. And that's 2-year-old data at this point. So the transition to the next phase of software is going to be even more expensive. Economic studies suggest about 30% more expensive. We know from other fields that that is likely accurate. I don't think it's up for debate in this scenario whether it's worth it. We can worst case scenario security problems all day long. But we know that we can't continue to do everything exactly the way we always have. And we know that we have to pay for it. And this is going to be another pivotal shift in how software is developed. So a lot of companies have come to treat open source more and more as a free supply chain with this endless well of raw materials that they don't understand the real value of and the real meaning of. And you hear now a lot about the software supply chain, about securing the supply chain attacks. It is a convenient shorthand. It makes a lot of sense. You have people, processes, tools, dependencies, now SBOMs. It looks like a traditional supply chain. But open source is different. It is not a supply chain, it is an ecosystem. And that's why I say that phrase so much, the open source ecosystem. Because ecosystems only work if everyone is playing their part, not just being stopping points or endpoints in a supply chain transaction. So think about it this way. A supply chain is linear. You identify a need, you procure the thing, the transaction is basically complete, you take what you need and it is done. But open source works on this ecosystem, this dynamic web of interconnected participants where everyone is contributing and everyone is benefiting in a multitude of ways. They work together in the places that they overlap so that they can all succeed faster in the places that they don't. It's about this mutual growth and this shared knowledge, and we all in this room understand the value of that. We also all learned in elementary school when you were a child about the ecosystem and how fragile it is, the natural ecosystem, and what happens if one part of it is not working, how it leads to the collapse of the entire thing. Likewise, open source is a bit of that fragile kind of natural ecosystem. If we're not putting back in what we're taking out, the well will dry up. So when you treat open source like a supply chain, you get code, that's fine. But when you treat it like the ecosystem that it is, you get community and innovation and better resilience and better security and long-term sustainability. And it can be easy to vilify enterprises for not having done this right for the last few years. Profit is king, you do what you have to do for shareholders. I understand that companies are complicated. I'm also okay with agreeing that we don't need to point blame in the past, as long as we help them all do it better in the future. So how do we help companies understand that? First of all, English has a shortcoming. We use free to mean lacking financial costs as well as lacking restrictions or control. So we have a saying to deal with that. Free as in puppies. So the puppy might be free to take home, but it's going to cost you a lot more in time and resources in the long run. Open source is free as in puppies. This is an excellent metaphor to help people who don't understand get there, and I've never been in a meeting where somebody was sad because you showed them a picture of a puppy. Which is to say, we have to be able to communicate these problems. Open source was built on a bit of a sort of unwritten social contract. You scratch an itch, share the result, collaborate if you want to, good times happen. Nobody promised that it was going to become the substrate of global commerce, but it did. And just like when IBM unbundled software 60-ish years ago, the market saw an opportunity to use that new structure to make a bunch of money. But just like when industry sees the natural ecosystem as an opportunity to make a bunch of money instead of the resource that it is that should be protected, the open source ecosystem is now suffering. So another metaphor to help, imagine you notice a loose paving stone outside of your house, out on the street. You don't want to trip on it, you don't want anybody else to trip on it, so you fix it. Then your neighbors notice that you fix that, and they ask you to fix theirs. And then the town notices, so they stop scheduling maintenance for your street because clearly somebody else has already taken care of it, so they don't need to spend that money anymore. And this apartment building over 3 streets sends you a letter and says that they're going to need the whole thing relayed by the end of Q3. And by the way, have you considered their accessibility concerns? That is literally the life of a maintainer. So you do your work in the public with strangers critiquing everything you do, and then companies start filing issues that are really more like support requests, but you're not a vendor and you don't have an SLA. And then they start demanding new features because somebody put it in their roadmap and Q3 requires it to happen. And then they get mad when you haven't done all of that for free by the end of the week. So today, the world's most critical software, the stuff that is running hospitals and networks and banking systems and the internet's plumbing, is often maintained by 1 or 2 people who just wanted to fix the paving stone so that nobody tripped. It might be unpaid, it might be in their spare time, it might be on a holiday weekend because a CVE dropped, it might be one of you. I heard some chuckles that imply that it may have been. And sometimes those people get frustrated and they get up and they walk away, and that's happening more and more. It's a sign of danger in the ecosystem. And we saw a couple of years ago what happens when they try to keep going. We get an XZ situation where there's an opportunity to take advantage of a struggling lone maintainer. Maintainer burnout is seriously one of the biggest problems facing software today. And money is a fix. It's a cool fix. Most of us like money. But sustainability isn't just about money. It's not only a funding problem. And every time somebody says open source needs more funding, they're kind of right, but they're treating a symptom, not the root cause. The deeper problems are really architectural, governance related, they're cultural. So a well-funded project, plenty of money, with a single maintainer is one dramatic health crisis away from trouble. A well-funded project with a really toxic community is going to burn through contributors faster than the money can flow in the door. So resilience means that the ecosystem is able to absorb those kinds of shocks. When a maintainer gets sick or burns out or just wants to go on vacation, the project can continue in a healthy fashion. When funding dries up, the project has enough reserves and can continue. When a security incident hits, there is a process. The project knows how to respond. When new regulations come in, they have the governance structure to adapt and move forward. So the funding question is a big one, and there are whole other talks out there about that all the time. Corporate funding is important. We have a lot of it. We can discuss whether we are using it in the best ways that we could be. And the flip side of that is when we start talking about all of this regulation, governments care a lot about vendor neutrality and who's controlling these things, and even the appearance of corporate control is a problem. So it's complicated. What is important is that it's critical for companies to be giving back in some fashion, whether that's financial, or with developer time, or ideally both, or in any number of ways. They have to be giving back. And what they need is a structure to do that. So if your organization, the companies you work for, haven't already stepped up to be a part of the ecosystem, I'm hoping to inspire you to be a part of changing that. How many of you work for a company that has an OSPO, an open source program office? Oh, that's distressing. And I actually know that some of you are wrong and you should look for your company's OSPOs. It's not a magical solution, but it is a solid start. And the way I think of it is when you have a company and there's something that is important enough to you to care about, you pay somebody to think about it all day. So think about a small company as it starts to grow. Maybe you were doing the accounting and the sort of HR tasks yourself, but then at a certain size, you go, we should probably pay somebody to do our accounting for us. It's more complicated now. When you care enough about something, you pay someone to think about it all day. And an OSPO is saying, we care about open source enough to pay somebody, or ideally several somebodies, to think about it all day. Given that, open source is likely some percentage of your product or process. So the idea of an OSPO is probably about 15 years old, really started picking up 10 years ago. We've seen some ebbs and flows in the number of them as historically, well before any of this, the department in a company that doesn't make money is often the one that gets laid off first. It used to be marketing for many decades. Now OSPOs sometimes hit that list. But OSPOs are the way that companies can figure out how to best link into the open source ecosystem to reap the benefits and give back. And you don't have to be a company that is deeply into open source, or even that really likes open source at all. But we know that effectively all software now is using open source components, and we know that pretty much everybody is a software company now, even if that's not what you're specifically making. So there is really nobody who can't benefit from having one. What an OSPO does is for people in the company who have never been a part of open source, it gives them someone to turn to for help. It can be a resource for the legal team on the wild assortment of legal team issues that come up. They often have many questions about licenses. It can help them open source things they've built internally. It can help them decide whether to build a new tool or dependency or buy it or go to the open source project. It can assess the health of open source projects that you want to be involved in. If this is interesting, and there were not a lot of hands raised that say you already have one, and you want to do this, there are plenty of resources out there. So there's a group called the To-Do group that has a GitHub with how to OSPO, basically. You can Google how to OSPO. Barring any of that, you can email me. I am always happy to help because I strongly feel that anything that benefits the open source ecosystem benefits us all, even if it is not benefiting me personally. So feel free to reach out. I am always happy to help. And companies that depend on open source, which as we established is kind of everybody, need to be, as I said, genuine partners in open source. Or as someone I worked with put it, stop being a leech on the open source ecosystem. What does that actually look like? I have a few ideas. First of all, reward contributors. And I used to be a big fan of the 10%, 20% time thing. And I've come to think that that probably really treats open source more like a fun side community service project instead of treating it like the critical work that it is. Reward contribution by putting it in development plans. Put it in annual reviews. Make it a part of everyone's job. And when I say everyone, I mean reward all contributors, because your company is probably full of people who could be open source contributors but don't know that it's a thing for them. How much better would your life be with better documentation or a more usable UX, UI? Rewarding contributors, not just for engineering, it's an everybody thing. Foster an upstream first culture. That means the default should be if we fix a bug or add a feature in an open source project, we send it upstream. Not fork it and maintain it, not we'll upstream it later, but upstream first. In fact, simply a default to open culture is the ideal. Humans are actually really collaborative and sharing by nature. We kind of unteach it somewhere in your school years where it's about keep your eyes on your own paper, do your own work, all of that. And then we get into companies where it's about competition and profit and all of that. But by nature, we are sharing creatures. And so this is the entire benefit of promise of open source. Share what you can and then focus on your differentiators. That's what makes a company successful when it uses open source. Participate in the ecosystem beyond the code, participate in governance, not just sending a check, but be involved in what keeps it running. Join foundations, serve on boards, do all of that. And finally, project security is an everyone problem. So it's not something that somebody else will take care of, you hope, someday, maybe. If you care about a project, you should care about its security too. This sounds obvious. Apparently it is not. Again, an OSPO is a great structure if you want to take this seriously. The companies that have invested in OSPOs, we have studies that show that they consistently have better upstream relationships, better security posture for their dependencies, better engineering cultures around contribution. For the people who care about things like retention, we see better retention of engineers. That is a business case. It's a real value to the company, not a bonus nice to have. Because again, what we're really talking about here is what is going to happen? What is the real cost to your company if open source can't survive? That's the business case for all of this. So, starting to wrap up, congratulations everyone. We're embarking on the third phase of that timeline. You have created the software that's running the world. You can high five each other. A little high five to each side. Find those people who raise their hands, they've been doing this forever. Maybe give them a hug and a beer later. That's amazing. This is a big job to maintain, though, and right now we are kind of suffering from our own success. We have been really good at adapting with change over the years, but now, this time, what we have to pay attention to has changed a little bit, and this time, instead of changing while being dismissed as something nobody cares about, as hobbyists, as never a commercial competitor, this time we have to change under the world's watchful eye. And remember that we're effectively here, but at the 2026 version, the beginning of phase 3. So I didn't really touch on how AI is going to change our lives because, like I said, the thoughts will be out of date by the time I finish the sentence. What we do know is that we're adding all of that complexity onto all of that other stuff that I did talk about. And we're trying to build a future that, like back here in 1998, most of us haven't really adequately imagined yet. But we've done it before, and if we get this right, we're going to get to do it again. The good news is that one of the things we've done in all those years together is build structures to do all this together, foundations like these. These are only the big ones, if you can kind of read that from here. I feel like every week I hear about another organization that is forming to make open source better, to help more people, to solve big problems. In the last few years, something even better has happened. We've decided that one of those big problems is that all these groups were doing great things alone, but not cohesively on the things that concern them all. So we started bringing all these foundations together for the first time to really dive into the things that concern them all. Of course, a lot of this is motivated by all of those new regulations that are going to affect all of us, but that is largely how we started to come together in these collaborative organizations, in these collaborative events that bring together these groups that have common interests. This is truly one of the most valuable things that the open source ecosystem has done in about the last 5 years. Coming together because we know collaborating is a better way. It's what we've been doing for almost 30 years. So now we're doing it at the next level. We're collaborating more together. And that's because we have learned from almost 3 decades of this that collaboration is where change happens. So just like in the beginning, I told you I searched my pictures for open source. This is what happened when I searched my Google Photos for collaboration, just the word collaboration. This is open source today. So these pictures show we have middle schoolers learning collaboration, learning the principles of open source and writing their first lines of Python. We have college students in an open hardware competition. We have game development studios meeting about how to use open source, which there are a lot of industries that have been very slow to come to this, and game development was not excited about open source for a long time. We have stakeholders down there discussing what the open source AI definition should look like and working together on that. So that's all there. This is open source after 30 years, and it's amazing. And I'd say that this is where the magic happens, but it's not magic. It is, again, collaborative creatures, the people that we are, doing what we do naturally and working together. Which is also why, although collaboration and community are not actually called for in the open source definition, it's not in there at all, but it's what we're known for because that's what makes it as successful as it's been. It's also why a few years ago we changed the name of the ASF flagship conference from ApacheCon to Community Over Code. And I'm a big fan of that because it is the answer to all of those challenges. I told you way back in the beginning, spoilers, the answer is community. It is the only way to ensure sustainability of the ecosystem, to address all of the increasing security challenges, to face the regulatory changes, to deal with whatever AI throws at us next week and the week after and the week after. It's through community, to pull together. Community is the foundation of what got us here. We didn't always agree. That would be a very rosy-glow reinterpretation of history. But we did do it together. And even though everything is different now, one thing has to stay the same, and that's community. Because good community can fix bad code. But an unhealthy community not only won't create the best code, it won't get us through all of these challenges in the years to come. And so that's it. If you have any questions at all, I think we may or may not have a minute or two. We have minutes for questions. You're always welcome to reach out. I know people always say that, but I genuinely mean it because, like I said, anything that benefits the open source ecosystem benefits all of us, not just me. If you can spell my last name, I'm Suehle@apache.org. If you can only spell Ruth, you can email ruth@cloudera.com. If you can spell my last name, you can very easily find me on the internet, because apparently I'm the only one of my husband's family who ever found the internet. So there aren't very many of us. Anybody have any questions? And if you don't want to ask into the microphone, I will be here drinking coffee all day.
Anyone wants to ask any question? Yes.
So, hello, thanks for the talk. So, when I was fiddling around with my own project, I was thinking about how we can re-extract money from the AI companies, basically. So I was wondering,
Who isn't?
can we? How about an open source license which is just open, but where AI companies have to pay for scraping, for example?
Well, if you
Things
have to
like
pay, it's
this.
not an open source license anymore.
Sorry?
If you have to pay, it's not an open source license anymore.
Yeah, you would also change this, yeah. But that's yeah. But basically the Anthropic OpenAI, they would have to pay. Basically.
Okay.
And if they don't, they get like a huge damage fee, right? Something like this. What do you think about this?
So I'm going to sit here because those lights are ridiculous and I can't see any of you, but I can down here. Is that cool? I think all of us are thinking about AI as well as how to solve the funding problem. I don't know that the answer is violating what we have known to be open source for the last 30 years to do it. That said, I didn't talk much about, I briefly mentioned that the open source AI definition exists. How many of you are aware that it exists? Not that many. Okay, so let me tell you a little story of the open source AI definition and what's happening next. So about 3 years ago now, I think it's been 2 years, the OSI, the Open Source Initiative, so that organization that has defined and stewarded the definition of what is open source for almost 30 years now, noticed that if you read the news, you see the phrase open source AI a lot, or open AI. One company decided to make this very difficult. We could not have to say open source AI and just say open AI, but they decided to make it hard for us. So if you read the news, you see that phrase all the time, but nobody agreed on what it meant, and most of them used it in ways that we do not recognize as what open source actually is. And so the OSI said, you know what we need to do? We need to work on a definition so that we all agree what open source AI means, and launch this year-long process to talk to stakeholders. And so I ran a couple of the early workshops. Actually, some of the original questions were, we have an open source definition, we have open source licenses, do we actually need a separate one for AI? And we came to the conclusion that we did. The first version, the sort of 0.1, I think we call it, launched at All Things Open, which is a conference in the US in October last fall. Sorry, the timeline gets fuzzy. And what we're doing now, the OSI has a fresh new executive director. His name is Dwayne O'Brien. He started on April 13th, and he is starting working on what the next iteration will be. And so it will be open to all of you to have input on refining what that is. What does open source AI mean? And I'm sure that a part of that will be, how do we think about this for, like I said, sustainability is not only about money. It's not all about funding. In fact, a lot of us did this without much of any money for a very long time. And while we can't do that anymore, we do have to find new ways to support the things that we have to do. Again, not sure that violating what we know to be open source is the way. But as we just have that discussion about what open source AI means and whether there are things that will meet that definition, it's super complicated. So for those of you who reluctantly raised your hand to acknowledge that you had heard of this, the biggest controversy over the state of it right now is whether the data, the training data, has to be open. And that's a complicated question. What if the training data is 10,000 x-rays of children's broken arms? I can't just give you that data. What if it is data from CERN that came through so fast that I really, and so much that I really can't capture it and give it to you, but it is otherwise an open system? What does that mean? So that's some of the discussions we'll be having next. And if that's interesting to you, so opensource.org is still the OSI website, just like it was way back at the beginning of the slides. And you can go, I think probably deep dive AI. I don't know that we've updated the site recently to reflect everything that's going to happen soon, but UN Open Source Week, United Nations Open Source Week, which I mentioned there, is in about 2 weeks. And one of the things we're going to do there is talk to the member states of the UN about what open source AI means to them. We didn't get a lot of governmental input the first time around, so that will be very helpful. And that's going to kind of really kick off the next iteration of these discussions, which I hope to see all of you in. That was a really long answer to half of a question.
It's only 2 companies. Yeah. So basically, we would just have to attack in a way 2 companies: OpenAI, Anthropic, maybe a few more. And
you're a man with a mission.
Yeah, I know. And basically, because now they just profit from us, right? I mean, and
They're also putting some
trillions.
back in. I don't know if you're aware, but
Yeah.
Anthropic gave a 7-digit number to the Apache Software Foundation last month.
Yeah, okay, but that's only some
Just
goodwill,
saying.
some peanuts they throw at us, right? I would be radical, but
Okay,
yeah,
so
that's just me.
If you feel like it's peanuts, I invite you also. The Apache Software Foundation is a nonprofit 990 founded in the United States, which means that you can go look up exactly what our budget and our spending is at any time that it strikes you. The number is 990. You Google Apache Software Foundation 990. You go compare that number to the number that Anthropic gave us and let me know if it's still peanuts. Well, I only care what it is to me.
Okay, I think we have time for one last short question, and then.
Sorry, this isn't going to be a short question.
Cool.
But yeah, it's fine. Everything's great. How do you start to address the disparity between consumers of open source and people who actually financially support or otherwise hire maintainers?
Describe who you mean as consumers.
People who use open source in their projects. As in, there's a significant amount of companies and people and organizations that use a significant amount of open source, but only a small fraction of those actually contribute back in any way.
Yeah, that's kind of what the whole talk was about.
Shh.
My whole thing for several years now has been trying to help companies understand that this only works if they're not just users, if they're not just leeches on the ecosystem, if they're putting back in. And the only way that I know to do that is to try to enlist all of you in my little open source army to go back to your companies, to go to other companies and help them understand this. And we're making progress. Like it is getting better, but the future it's not sealed yet. So there's still work to be done. Is there some aspect I did not cover that you're, yeah? You're good. Okay, cool.
Okay, great. So a big round of applause for Ruth Suehle. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.